Welcome to the Blended Finance Project interview series, where we talk to international development and solidarity scholars, labor and civil society activists about the recent turn to so-called innovative finance for development in Canada. I'm your host, Susan Spronk, Associate Professor at the School of International Development and Global Studies at the University of Ottawa. We're today with Stephen Brown, who's professor at the School of Political Studies at the University of Ottawa. He's also affiliated with the school that I teach at, the School of International Development and Global Studies. And he spent his career working on questions of North and South and the relationships between North and South, and especially in sub-Saharan Africa. And he's published on a wide range of different topics, including democratization, political violence, peace building, transitional justice. And his most recent work is on foreign aid, and I think it's safe to say that he is one of Canada's foremost experts on Canadian foreign aid. So we're really happy to have you with us, Stephen. Thanks for coming.
I'm happy to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
Great. So we're going to get started with a question on foreign aid, or what we call official development assistance. So you've spent your career writing on this topic. Why do you think it's so important?
Wow, I mean, that's kind of a big question. I think at the root of my interest in foreign aid is the idea of social justice or greater equality, or it's definitely from a normative place where, and this might sound a bit Pollyanna-ish, but I want the world to be a better place. And there are many things that can be done by different actors to make the world a better place. But I've been mostly interested in international inequality. I mean, I'm certainly, interested in poverty in Canada and the need to fight against it. But I focus mostly on international dynamics around wealth and poverty and inequality. And I'm especially interested in foreign aid as a tool for trying to reduce these problems, or eliminate ideally, because states have a lot of power and states are accountable to citizens. So I don't feel I can do as much to influence, a multinational corporation, but I feel that countries have a very important role and a problematic one. I mean, the aid relationship is a difficult one, but this idea that public actors have a role to play, not just private ones. And people will often say things like, well, foreign investment, foreign direct investment, or even private remittances are so much more important than foreign aid. Foreign aid is passé. Foreign aid isn't as much as those things. But foreign aid is really our international tool for reducing poverty. Foreign direct investment doesn't have the goal to reduce poverty and inequality, it's to make profit. And remittances are private transfers that may go to reducing poverty, but could also go to like conspicuous consumption. So I think that foreign aid is a really important tool in our toolbox, not the only one, but a really important one, and one that deserves more scrutiny.
And for the purposes of this series too, one of the important things you point out is that it's a public source of money. And so as citizens, we want to be concerned about how it's being used by the governments as well. Great. So that leads me to my next question, which is, in your work on foreign aid, you've warned of the dangers of commercialization and instrumentalization of aid. So how would you characterize blended finance, and how does it relate to these trends that you've identified?
Okay, so let me start by explaining what I mean by those terms. So commercialization means using, in this case, foreign aid to advance the commercial goals of the donor country. So if we say something like, you buy, fighter jets from us, or you get us to build this dam, we'll give you more foreign aid, or something like that. And that's currently illegal in Canada. That we have the ODA Accountability Act. So since 2008, the purpose of foreign aid is to reduce poverty. So there used to be a number of mechanisms that used aid that is supposed to help others to help ourselves, including things like tide aid or direct subsidies to Canadian companies. CIDA, the Canadian International Development Agency, used to have a special unit called CIDA Inc., or Industrial Cooperation, that supported Canadian companies. And so we were using aid money meant to help the world's poor to help Canadian companies. And this was also done through tide aid. So officially, this is no longer the case. Officially, we've seen support the mining sector in countries where Canadian mining in ways that can be beneficial to Canadian mining interests. So it's not a direct subsidy, but it's at least an indirect one. And then by instrumental to advance other Canadian interests. So for instance, you can talk about commercial interests. You can also talk about security interests. So that was very important in Afghanistan, where we were using aid to try to support Canadian troops in their fight against the Taliban. So for me, that's sort of a diversion of aid from its purpose and often not a very effective one. So then how does this apply to blended finance? Well, very often there's certainly a fear and a potential, and it's often the case if you look globally, that blended finance, though its official goal is to reduce poverty or promote development, it very often goes to companies from the country where the blended finance agency is based, or it benefits middle-class people, and which isn't the primary target for poverty reduction for obvious reasons. So things like, investing in an upscale shopping mall or something like that. So the European NGOs have done a lot of research into this and found a lot of use of blended finance that really doesn't go towards development, or certainly not a concept of development that has to do with reducing poverty and inequality.
And following on that, I think one of the things that's also been identified is that it goes to middle income countries and
Yes.
also sectors like industry and also the extractive sector, and
Yes.
not health and education, and those things are not bankable. And so they've really done a great job exposing that. Okay, so can you tell us a little bit about why the Canadian government decided to establish FinDev in 2017? There's a lot of controversy surrounding it, including the fact that it's under Export Development Canada, also its recent leader. So could you tell us about some of those controversies surrounding this new organization? What is it supposed to do and how is it doing so far?
So it was actually the Harper government that announced in a budget that they would create a development finance institute. And they didn't come up with a very coherent argument for it. They said things like, oh, we're the only G7 country that doesn't have one. And, but I mean, that's not a very convincing reason to do something. And in fact, they never did it. And then the Trudeau government came into power and they just re-announced it, the exact same thing with the same budget, $500 million. Or was it 300? Now I'm not sure. But okay, this will go on the web with me appearing not to know what I'm talking about. But whatever the amount was, it was between $300 and $500 million. The idea was to create not only an instrument that would promote the role of the private sector in development, but in the case of Canada, since it was announced by the Liberal government, that it would be a very, not just a poverty reducing one, but a feminist one. So they would help, it would help especially women and women entrepreneurs and so on. Now, a lot of people were worried, including me, that this money would be sort of a reinvention, that this institute would be a reinvention of CETA Inc. that I mentioned earlier, and go to Canadian companies and basically be a form of export credit that counts as foreign aid. Now that doesn't seem to be the case. A warning sign was that it was put under Export Development Canada, as you mentioned, which is very disconnected from official Canadian foreign policy and from Global Affairs Canada. And it's a for-profit institution, and it's not actually covered by the access to information mechanism. So these were signs that it could be highly problematic. Now, they were given a mission that was to use development finance, but to direct it at poverty reduction and women and the poorest of the poor and so on. And it wasn't clear how they were going to do that, because as we were saying earlier, development finance money doesn't tend to go to the poor countries. And when it does go to poor countries, it doesn't tend to go to the poor people. And it doesn't tend to go to women either. So you need special mechanisms. And this is where it's like you can make more money from middle class people than you can from poor people. And the whole point of a development finance institution is that it makes investments that make a profit, they take the profit back and then they reinvest it. So I don't know how much you can make from, you know, poor women living in, you know, urban slums. Then, you know, as you referred to, there was the exit of the head of FinDev under odd circumstances in terms of his previous employment. There have also been some critiques of what they chose to invest in with their first announcements, that the whole idea was to be innovative and to, you know, do things that wouldn't have been done otherwise, but they tended to just join in on things that were already being done and taking a very small stake. So then what is the value added if these things were going to be done anyway, and we just put in, you know, 10% of the budget or something like that.
Great. So you mentioned the Feminist International Assistance Policy, which was also newly announced. It's been about 4 years now. And so could you tell us a little bit more about how you think that this agenda connects with blended finance, if at all? Do they complement each other? Do they contradict each other? What would you say to that?
So officially they go like hand in glove, but that remains to be seen. I mean, when you think of the private sector and you think of its record in terms of promoting women or the involvement of women, like just even in Canada or the US, look at, you know, the most innovative sector like Silicon Valley, like what's the role of women as head of these corporations on the board of directors and so on. So I'm quite skeptical of the private sector's dedication to principles of gender equality and advancing the role of women. And I think historically it's because of the public sector and because of government regulation that we've had protection from discrimination, that we've had legislation around wages and so on. So I think it's quite a jump to just sort of say, okay, we're going to take blended finance, but it's going to be feminist, it's going to be pro-women, it's going to be, and this is very much a hypothetical case. It remains to be seen if they can really pull that off. I mean, you can do things like microloans to female entrepreneurs, but there's a whole literature that critiques microfinance, and including the high interest rates that you would need to charge to be able to get your money back. I mean, if this is an investment where you need your money back and not a form of, you know, donation. So it remains to be seen to what extent it really can be feminist. One thing that I find interesting about FIAP, the Feminist International Assistance Policy, is that tucked in towards the end, there's a couple of pages that talk about partnerships with the private sector and so on. And other than throwing in gender equality in women and girls, it could have been written by the previous government. And I think that's not a coincidence, because blended finance and the establishment of a you know, development finance institution was proposed by the Conservatives. And so I think we see a lot of continuity in aid policies in general, but specifically around collaborating with the private sector. And there's a whole rationale behind that in terms of we don't want to, we being Canada, so the Canadian government and other governments, because it's not just Canada, we don't want to increase our foreign aid spending, which was the case for the Conservatives and the Liberals right now. If any increases are just very small. And in fact, if we're going to fund the sustainable development goals, we need to go from, the cliche goes from billions to trillions. We have to unlock all this money that's allegedly sitting around in the private sector, and, you know, to get trillions of dollars a year to go towards development, and that's the only way to achieve the sustainable development goals. But so part of what blended finance is we don't want to pay for it ourselves. We will just put in a little bit of money, and that will leverage other money. And, you know, maybe you need to leverage 10 to 1 or something like that. But again, studies have shown that the amount that's leveraged is far inferior to that. And sometimes it's not even 1 to 1. And that in the poorest countries and in fragile states and conflict affected states, it's the hardest to leverage additional money. So the Feminist International Policy sort of slips in this stuff about working with the private sector. it talks about, other innovative modalities, like a mix of repayable and non-repayable financing, which means loans. They're going to reintroduce loans. And in fact, they are reintroducing loans. So Canada did away with loans in the 1980s. It wasn't found to be a good way to do development. It required a lot of admin, and it led to, the debt crisis. But so Canada's reintroducing that. And in a recent federal budget, I think it was almost 3 years ago now, Canada reintroduced other kinds of, innovative financing modalities. They announced it, attributed hundreds of millions of dollars to it, but never really explained what it was. And this was something that, Global Affairs Canada didn't have much experience in, and it's taken them a very long time to get it going. Jeffrey York had an interesting article a few months ago in the Globe and Mail pointing out how they have these huge budgets and they're hardly spent any of it. I talked to a former senior official from the Canadian Development Program who said they just don't know what they're doing. They're following the latest trend, but they don't know how to do it. And so they made these bold announcements, but then they don't have the skills to follow it up, and they don't have the appetite for risk either.
And what you're saying also underscores something that a couple of our other guests have really emphasized, is that why don't we think about debt forgiveness as part of this agenda? Because when we're talking, especially in the context of a pandemic like COVID-19, funding the healthcare sector, for example, is not viable from private sector engagement strategy. We're crushing the ability of these countries to actually come up with viable health alternatives, include vaccination plans, which puts the whole world at risk.
Yeah, and social spending is not profitable. Unless you go for private clinics and private schools, and then again, you're not reaching the poorest of the poor. So if we want to provide support and actual poverty reduction in the short term and maybe even the medium term, you can't just go for these kinds of for-profit. I think development finance is predicated on the idea that investment leads to growth and growth will lead to poverty reduction. But that's a little bit too hypothetical, and there are too many intervening steps. And if anything, the pandemic has shown how much immediate welfare, social safety net spending is, how important that is. And but there's no profit. So if you're using reimbursable loans, then you're actually not helping.
And one of the things that the UN system, for example, a UN Conference on Trade and Development had a report in 2019 on financing for mitigating climate change or the ecological crisis, talk about the necessity of public sources of finance, just as you were saying. So that leads me to my final question, which is about alternatives. And more specifically, if you had to tell the Canadian government how to use official development assistance, what would you say?
A lot of what I would say is stuff that's been said for decades. So I'm not going to pretend to be, very original and innovative. And I think the problem is we're trying to be too innovative all the time. And we're always chasing the shiny new thing rather than doing what we already do well or doing what works. So let me just give you a quick list. And if you want me to expand on any of them, I will. But so, one would be to spend more money on aid. Canada's a relatively stingy country. We're below average for the OECD and nowhere near the targets that we announced as far back as 1970. Our current government is no better than the Harper government. If you average out how much they've been spending, they're equally generous or equally not generous. But money isn't the only thing. Not only do we need more aid, but maybe even more important, we need better aid. So we need to stop prioritizing Canadian priorities. So Canada keeps having, since at least 2002, as like a number of flavors of the month. Certain sectors where we want to work, like agriculture or children, or women have come and gone, and governance and democracy, and every time we have a new government, we change, but sometimes even within a government, we change themes. So, we keep reorienting towards food security in the mid 2000s, and now we're moving towards something else. Well, actually now apparently we're going back towards food security. And so identifying these niche areas where we want to work is contrary to the principles of aid effectiveness, which is our priorities should be the priorities of the recipient country. So that kind of flavor of the month is harmful. I would stop that. I would also stop, actually the current government has stopped it, but having designated countries of focus, because we kept changing, and sometimes they'd be a country of focus and then we drop them, and then 5 years later it'd be a country. So we'd like ramp up, ramp down, ramp up. This is not effective, and it harms Canada's ability to be a long-term reliable partner. I would reinvest in Global Affairs Canada, in skills, hire people for careers, not on contract. I would invest in their skills, and in assuming that they would stay around for a while, and have human resources policies that would make them stay around or encourage them to stay around. We wouldn't force them, but to have more in-house capacity. And I would also make sure that more of the senior bureaucrats would actually have experience in development and understand development. Part of the philosophy of the public sector is that you can just rotate. You can be, assistant deputy minister in Transport Canada one day and then at Global Affairs another day. But I think running development requires a quite deep understanding of the issues. It's not like there's something special about that sort of file. I'd say decentralize as well. Canada is one of the most centralized programs in the world. We have tried to decentralize in the past to field offices, to embassies and aid offices around the world, but it quickly got reversed because it costs more. And also because Canada is very risk averse and very controlling. So even if we decentralize the staff, we need to give more delegated authority to lower down people and people in the field to actually approve projects. So, typically you'll have a meeting with, I'm just going to make up an example. The government of Tanzania has a meeting with the donors, and the Danes say, okay, we'll put in 10 million US dollars. And the Brits say, okay, we'll put in 15 million, and so on. And Canada will say, oh, I have to check with Ottawa. And so we're not seen as agile, as reliable. So I think there are many things that Canada can do to just improve development as it is. I'm not saying never innovate, but I'm saying stop chasing it, stop announcing new things on the fly and then figuring out how to do it. Stop, focusing, stop having, I guess the equivalent of ADD. Like pick a lane and do it well, and get your staff who's competent and well-trained and have institutional memory, and trust your staff more, have less political interference. And I guess the final point I would say is less branding. And as much as I'm in favor of gender equality and additional focus on women and girls, I'm concerned that by labeling our current policy feminist and having it so closely associated with the Liberal government, we're basically guaranteed that when the next government comes in, especially if it's the Conservatives, they will tear it up and put in a different policy, or maybe have no policy at all. So the more we identify policies with a given government, the more chance that when a new one comes in, they're just going to change it. And that's just a recipe for inefficient aid.
Although we might want a government to change their blended finance policy. But there's two things there. There's two things there in that list that I'd like a little bit more information on. And the first one is, you mentioned decentralization. So what's the role of civil society organizations? Because I think one of the things that we can both agree on is that Canada has a very vibrant environment or ecology of NGOs and labor unions who have something to say about international development and international solidarity. So what's the role of those kinds of organizations in this vision you have? And then secondly, you mentioned that it's very important to have the priorities set by countries that are receiving the aid. So would that mean budget support? And then related to that, how do you know which governments to relate to? Because it often comes up, this question about, well, what about the countries that violate?
Yeah.
What do we do with that? Because you addressed that question, those two questions, that'd be great.
Yeah, I'll take the first one first, and probably because it's the easier one. And I didn't mention civil society in my list, and I'm glad you brought it up because it should have been on that list. As you say, we have so many really competent organizations, and they are way too often treated as service delivery organizations. So, the government comes up with what it wants to do, and then it gets an NGO to do it. And this creates a relationship that really stretches the meaning of civil society or non-governmental, because it, among other things, it really impedes accountability and the ability to do advocacy. And so under the Harper government, there was a huge chill around advocacy. Under the current government, it's less of, less of a stick in terms of you criticize us, we cut off your funding, and more of a carrot, more of like a co-optation and, praising each other on Twitter and social media and so on. So it really means that most Canadian, not all, but most Canadian civil society organizations are very hesitant to criticize the Canadian government's aid policies. So a lot more could be done to build on their expertise. And I think the biggest recommendation I would have for that is do core funding. Like if you think an NGO is good, give them money so they can just do their work. Don't say our priority is, this country in this area, and please bid on this, or we might choose you to do what we want, because then you're just a cheap subcontractor, cheaper than a private sector consultancy would have been for doing the same work, presumably. So yeah, so get more input from civil society, trust civil society, provide core funding, though it is a bit of a double-edged sword, because then if NGOs or CSOs become too dependent on the government, that's like, there's a cost to that as well. Now, your second question is more difficult. Now I've suddenly forgotten what it was. Oh yeah, so what do you do instead? So like, do you do budget support? So budget support means you just hand over money to, let me just use the example of Tanzania again, just because I mentioned it earlier. So you either give it to the Ministry of Finance, so it goes into the general pot, or you might have like support to a specific sector like education, so you could give it to the Ministry of Education. And often this kind of budget support is pooled with other donors. And in theory, this is like a great implementation of principles of, having local ownership of the development agenda, having donors aligning with the local government's plans, coordination or harmonization among the donors. It's sort of like the epitome of how it should work. But there was often a disenchantment with this. And so in the late 2000s, there was a huge rise in budget support, but there's been a decline since then, because what do you do with, you're supporting government and then they steal the elections, or they, arrest all the opposition leaders, or they pass a law, with capital punishment for LGBT people, or, the president spends $20 million on a private jet, or, something like that. So it's really tricky, because that kind of support actually in a way increases the power of the donors over the recipient country, because if you've got this pool fund that's in cash that you're just handing over, it's like this tap that you could just turn off. It's like, we were going to give you another 200 million next month, but now we're not going to. So in a way, increases this power inequality. So getting back to like how I would answer that, do you do budget support and how do you decide? Well, sometimes you do budget support in certain conditions when you can, but you don't do it everywhere. And you have a sort of portfolio approach where you do budget support, but you also have support to local NGOs or things like that. So you don't put all your eggs in one basket. And this is where you really need people who have deep knowledge of the country, who are not sitting in Ottawa and rotating desks every 2 years, people who are based in the country, hopefully staying for more than 2 years, who are embedded, who understand what's going on, who are not just, reading the media online or something like that, who have contacts, and including can work with certain parts of the government. So you might have a government that's corrupt in some areas, but not in another. So let's say the Ministry of Education is corrupt, but the Ministry of Health is not. Well, then focus more on health. Or, within a ministry, there's a certain directorate or something, or concentrate on that. So I have no blanket recommendation. And I guess we shouldn't seek to have blanket recommendations, because we're not like, we know not to do cookie cutter approaches and apply the same thing everywhere. But it requires a kind of finessing, like a nuanced reading of changing local conditions. And that's where I find that Global Affairs Canada and other organizations are just not well equipped, because they're just not set up that way with the staffing and the training and the deployment of people.
Yeah, and I think what you just said really underscores the need for people in the field that know what they're doing, people who are career professionals, who have stable employment, who get to know the cases that they're working in to do aid well and effectively. And that environment changes rapidly as well. So that's excellent. I really enjoyed this conversation. I learned a lot. Thank you so much for joining us, and I hope you have a great afternoon.
My pleasure.